You know, neighbors, the people you wave to over the fence, the ones you trust with your spare key, and who you hope will keep things friendly, even when times get tough. You lend them a cup of sugar, they borrow your lawnmower, and maybe, just maybe, don't start a massive trade war with you. That's how it's supposed to work, right? A little give, a little take, and everyone gets along. But with President Trump in the White House, international relations turned unpredictable, like a reality TV show with surprise plot twists. One day you're watching the news, and the next, you're wondering if your neighbor is about to flip the board game and storm out. For Canada, America's usually polite neighbor to the north, things got tense fast. The relationship, once marked by easy cooperation, suddenly felt like walking on eggshells. It all started with America First, which quickly became America First, everyone else. Good luck. The slogan wasn't just a catchphrase, it was a warning shot across the bow for America's trading partners. Suddenly the air was thick with tariffs. Yes, that word from history class making a dramatic comeback. Steel, aluminum, cars, nothing was safe. The rules of the game were changing, and fast. Trump's push to protect U.S. manufacturing meant import taxes from early 2025, and Canada, despite being a close ally, was hit hard. Factories on both sides of the border braced for impact, and workers wondered what would come next. It was like being invited to a party where the main event was you getting a surprise bill for everything you touched. Suddenly every handshake came with a price tag, and every deal felt a little less friendly. The new U.S. trade policies weren't minor tweaks, they were economic shots fired. The message was clear: play by America's new rules, or pay the price. For Canada, whose economy is deeply tied to the U.S., this was more than a headache, it was a potential migraine. Businesses scrambled to adapt, and politicians scrambled to respond, all while the markets watched nervously. The old playbook for U.S.-Canada trade was out the window, and nobody knew what the new rules were. It was a new era, one where even the closest neighbors had to watch their backs, and every handshake could be the start of a new battle. So, what exactly was in Trump's tariff cocktail, and why did it send shockwaves through Canada's economy? For Canada, the main ingredients were two of its most vital exports: steel and aluminium. These metals are the backbone of Canadian manufacturing, supporting thousands of jobs and entire communities. In March 2025, a 25% tariff slammed down on these metals, instantly making Canadian steel and aluminium far more expensive for American buyers. By June, the pressure doubled, tariffs shot up to a staggering 50%. For many Canadian exporters, this was a devastating blow, threatening their access to their largest market. Only Britain managed to escape the worst, thanks to a last-minute trade deal that softened the impact for their exporters. For Canada, the top exporter of steel and aluminium to the U.S., this was a direct hit to its economic core. Factories, mills, and transport companies all felt the shock. And it didn't stop there. February saw a 25% tax slapped on a wide range of Canadian imports, from machinery to consumer goods, making cross-border trade even more expensive. On top of that, a 10% tax was imposed on Canadian energy exports, including oil and gas, further squeezing a sector already facing global uncertainty. These weren't minor products, they were pillars of Canada's export economy, supporting everything from local jobs to national infrastructure. The message from Washington was clear: we love you, Canada, but your goods are going to cost you and us a lot more. The era of easy, predictable trade was over. Canadian producers suddenly faced massive new costs, putting them at a serious disadvantage compared to global competitors. Many businesses were forced to rethink their entire strategy. If something costs 50% more, buyers look elsewhere. Canadian goods started losing ground to cheaper alternatives from other countries. The U.S. also demanded best offers from all trading partners by July to avoid even more tariffs, creating a climate of constant anxiety and uncertainty for Canadian businesses. Planning for the future became nearly impossible for industries that depended on stable U.S. trade. The ripple effects of these tariffs would be felt across Canada for years to come. These tariffs weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they hit Canadian industries hard. Steel and aluminium sectors, supporting thousands of jobs, were on the front lines. When your main customer makes your product 50% more expensive, it's a direct threat to jobs and communities. Even companies like Lululemon felt the impact, with shares dropping as tariffs raised costs. Tariffs on raw materials ripple through the economy, raising prices or cutting profits. The American Automotive Policy Council warned tariffs would raise car assembly costs, hurting Canada's auto sector, which is deeply integrated with the U.S. Parts and vehicles cross the border multiple times. Tariffs throw a wrench in the works. North American-built cars got pricier, threatening sales and jobs. The uncertainty chilled business investment and confidence. Companies delayed expansion, hiring, and new equipment purchases. The U.S. Congressional Budget Office projected a drop in U.S. output, and when the U.S. sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Trade wars aren't just about numbers, they're about people. For Canadian workers in steel, aluminium, and manufacturing, tariffs meant real anxiety about jobs and paychecks. Imagine working in a steel plant in Hamilton, or an aluminium smelter in Quebec. Your job depends on U.S. sales, now blocked by tariffs. Companies struggled to compete, and layoffs or reduced hours became real threats. The stress in these communities was palpable. The impact rippled out. Local businesses and suppliers felt the pinch too. The OECD and IMF downgraded global growth forecasts, citing tariffs as a key reason. Canada, heavily reliant on U.S. trade, was especially vulnerable. Labor unions like Unifor called for strong retaliation to protect jobs. The human stories of families facing uncertainty became central to the narrative, reminding everyone that trade policy has real-world consequences. The United States, Canada's largest and most vital trading partner, suddenly imposed sweeping tariffs. It sent shockwaves through the Canadian economy. The stakes were enormous. Billions of dollars in goods and thousands of jobs hung in the balance. With its biggest trading partner going rogue, Canada had to respond, but the path forward was anything but simple. Enter Prime Minister Mark Carney, a leader known for his calm under pressure and sharp economic instincts. He faced a tough balancing act: defend Canadian interests without escalating into a full-blown trade war that could spiral out of control. Carney's challenge was to show strength, but also to keep the door open for negotiation and compromise. On June 4, 2025, Carney made it clear: Canada was negotiating hard, but preparing reprisals if talks failed. He addressed the nation and the world, emphasizing that Canada would not be bullied, but would also not act rashly. Translation: don't mistake our politeness for weakness. Carney's words resonated with Canadians, who are known for their diplomacy, but also for their resolve when pushed. In a bold move, Canada had already retaliated, slapping a 25% tax on some U.S. vehicles in April. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a targeted strike at a key American export, designed to get Washington's attention. The goal was clear: make the U.S. feel some of the pain it was inflicting, and remind American leaders that trade is a two-way street. Canadian auto workers and manufacturers braced for impact, but stood united behind their government's tough stance. Domestically, pressure mounted for even stronger action. Ontario Premier Doug Ford urged Carney not to let Trump steamroll Canada. Across the country, politicians and citizens alike debated how far Canada should go to defend its interests. The government had to de-escalate with one hand while preparing to push back with the other. Behind closed doors, officials weighed every option, from further tariffs to diplomatic outreach, knowing that every move would be scrutinized at home and abroad. It was a high-stakes balancing act, with Canada's economic well-being on the line. The financial markets watched nervously, and business leaders called for stability and clarity. The message was clear: Canada would not just roll over. Instead, it would stand firm, using both diplomacy and economic leverage to protect its future. Instead, it would defend its industries and workers, even if it meant a little diplomatic hockey: tough, strategic, and always playing to win. The spirit of Canadian resilience was on full display. The world was watching to see if Canada could keep its cool under pressure. International media outlets analyzed every move, and other nations quietly took notes on Canada's measured response. And so far, it was doing just that, showing the world that even in the midst of a tariff storm, Canada could remain calm, collected, and ready for whatever came next. With the US turning hostile, Canada started looking elsewhere. If your main dance partner keeps stepping on your toes, you look for someone new, and for Canada, that meant Europe. The EU, a massive market, looked increasingly attractive as the US became unpredictable. Canadian businesses saw the EU as a chance to reduce reliance on the US and find stability. The EU was also facing US trade tensions, creating a sense of solidarity. When you're both getting rained on by tariffs, it makes sense to build a stronger shelter together. The gaze eastward became more focused, not to abandon the US, but to rebalance. For Canadian businesses, Europe offered hope and a strategic way forward. Canada's pivot to Europe wasn't starting from scratch. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, was already in place, reducing tariffs and opening doors. CETA made selling to Europe easier and more attractive, especially as US trade became rocky. It was like having a high-speed motorway east, just as the road south filled with potholes. Canadian exporters were already learning the ropes in Europe thanks to CETA. The groundwork was laid, making deeper EU ties a realistic goal. As US trade policy turned protectionist, CETA shone as a beacon of open, rules-based trade. Shifting trade focus to Europe isn't as easy as flipping a switch. The EU is a huge market, but there are hurdles, logistics, costs, and complexity. Shipping across the Atlantic is tougher than trucking goods to the US. CETA helps, but it doesn't shrink the ocean. Canadian businesses must adapt supply chains and face longer lead times. The EU isn't one market, it's 27 countries, each with its own quirks. What sells in Canada might flop in Spain. Companies need to tailor products and marketing for diverse European tastes. But the payoff is diversification, less reliance on the US, more stability. Access to the EU's vast, stable market offers new revenue and resilience. Aligning with the EU's high standards could boost Canada's global reputation. June 2025, Canada stands at a crossroads. Trump's tariffs have shaken the US-Canada relationship to its core. The big question, is Canada's pivot to Europe a permanent shift or a temporary move? The government's actions, negotiations, retaliation, and deeper EU ties suggest a serious intent to diversify. The risks of relying on one partner are now painfully clear. Europe offers real opportunities, but the transition won't be easy or quick. The US will always matter, but Canada is now looking beyond its backyard. Ironically, Trump's trade tactics may have pushed Canada to explore a wider world of possibilities. As the dust settles from the tariff turmoil, Canada's newfound partnership with Europe begins to bear fruit. Canadian maple syrup, tech innovations, and green energy solutions are finding new homes on European shelves and in EU cities. Small businesses, once anxious about their future, report steady growth, thanks to easier access to European markets. Yet this strengthened bond with the EU isn't just about trade, it's changing how Canadian firms think, encouraging innovation and collaboration across continents. New cultural exchanges and joint ventures are on the rise, weaving Canada more tightly into the global tapestry. There are challenges, of course, adapting to new regulations, overcoming language barriers, and competing with established European brands all test Canadian resilience. But the benefits, diversified markets, fresh investment, and greater economic security, are gradually outweighing the hurdles. For Canada, the aftermath of embracing Europe is still unfolding. But one thing is clear, the country is more connected, more agile, and more prepared for whatever comes next on the world stage. As Canada forges deeper ties with Europe, eyes from every corner of the globe are fixed on its next steps. In Washington, policymakers weigh the long-term impact of Canada's pivot, wondering if lost trade will return or if the North American dynamic has shifted for good. Meanwhile, countries like Australia and Japan observe with keen interest, assessing whether Canada's strategy might serve as a blueprint for their own trade ambitions. Emerging markets, too, are taking note. Some see opportunity in Canada's openness, hoping to negotiate new deals or strengthen existing relationships. Others worry about losing their own foothold as Canadian goods and services gain traction in Europe. International analysts debate, is this the start of a new trade era or a unique Canadian experiment? News outlets worldwide report on the ripple effects, highlighting both the risks and the rewards of stepping beyond traditional alliances. For Canada, the global spotlight is both a challenge and an invitation to prove that diversification pays off and to inspire other nations to follow suit, reshaping the world's economic landscape one partnership at a time. As Canada charts a fresh course on the world stage, the future of North American trade hangs in the balance. The once seamless flow of goods, services, and investments across the continent now faces new complexities. American businesses, long accustomed to easy access to Canadian partners, must adapt to shifting supply chains and evolving regulations. Mexican industries, too, keep a watchful eye, wary of disruptions that could ripple through the United States and beyond. For policymakers, the question is clear. Will the North American trade bloc remain resilient, or will old alliances fray in the face of global realignment? Some experts predict a gradual return to cooperation, fueled by shared interests and economic necessity. Others warn of a more fragmented future, where each nation pursues its own path, occasionally converging but often diverging. Amidst uncertainty, one thing is certain. Every move Canada makes now sets a precedent. The choices made today will echo for years, shaping not just the fortunes of Canadian workers and businesses, but the very foundation of North American prosperity. As the continent stands at a crossroads, the world waits to see whether unity or division will define the next era of trade.